All right, good evening. How you guys doing? Good. How's the time change treating you? We'll see in about an hour, right when it's bedtime normally, and this may not be as interesting as it was at the first 30 minutes or so, so we'll get it moving here, try to move it along tonight. So thanks for coming. So tonight we are talking about Judaism and Islam, and we'll get into that just a bit more after we pray and get started. You guys ready? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your goodness and your mercy to us. Thank you for the opportunity to gather together and discuss. God, what a cool thing it is that you've given us the ability to be curious, and you've given that to us for a reason, so that we may know you more, so that we may know your creation more, so that we may understand our place and our purpose in all of this a little bit more. And so, Father, may we be people who are curious. That one of the great dangers of life is becoming certain in areas that certainty is not possible. And so, Father, may we be curious people, because according to your word, you're a rewarder of those who diligently seek you. And I'm a believer that you're a rewarder of all those who diligently seek. And so, Father, may we be people who diligently seek, who are curious and not cynical, who really find hope in what we find. Because in all of truth, we're finding you at work and we're finding your goodness continuing to move forward. And so, Father, may this be a night of curiosity. May it be a night where we come to better understand you, come to better understand those that you've created in your image, and our place in this world, our purpose in this world. And so, Father, we just thank you for that opportunity tonight. May you be glorified in all of it. Lord, it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, Judaism and Islam, all right? Why talk about those together? What are the commonalities between Judaism and Islam? Anybody know? What are some commonalities? Okay, they're both on the screen. Abrahamic faiths. Yeah, so they all derive, they call them the Abrahamic faiths along with Christianity, right? Because they all trace their origin to Abraham. Right? So Judaism and Christianity would trace it to Abraham through Isaac, the child of Sarah, right? Islam would trace it back to Ishmael, the son of Hagar, all right? So Hagar, if you want to find where it's in Genesis 16, right? Abram and Sarah. He is not Abraham in Genesis 16. He's still Abram, right? He doesn't become Abraham until Genesis 17, right? So after the birth of Ishmael, he becomes Abraham. And after the birth of Ishmael, God gives him the covenant promise. So Ishmael and Hagar happened before those things, right? And whether that's significant or not, you can deduce that for yourself a little bit. But that's the way it happens chronologically, at least in terms of Genesis. All right? And so they call them the Abrahamic faiths, largely because they trace themselves back to Abraham. All right? Anything else? Any other commonalities amongst them? In some sense, yeah. So, like I said, Genesis 16, Abraham, Hagar, and the birth of Ishmael is before the promise of 17, right? So there is something unique that happens in 17 that seems to be about Israel. But there are promises before that as well. So, anything else? What about the faiths themselves? What's common? Say it again? Monotheism, meaning one God. Now, we're going to talk about how especially Islam, would say that Christians are not monotheistic. They would say that the idea of the Trinity is heretical. How could God come in the flesh? How could God be more than one? Right? And so for them, they would look at us and say that we are not truly monotheistic. Right? Because we believe in the idea of God becoming man in Jesus, and also the idea of the Holy Spirit. So the Trinity, for them, is a huge problem. Right? They wouldn't view us as monotheistic in the way that they are. Right? And for them, that's a huge kind of dividing line often. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Anything else? They all come from the same locations, basically, right? They all started in a very small part of the world, right? That these three defining religions of the world, and they are the defining religions for the most part. You have some obviously large religious movements that came out of the East, in Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism. We'll talk about those next year a little bit. We'll get into some of those as well. But in the Western world especially, in the Middle East, these are the defining religions, right? They're the largest religions in the world between them, especially Christianity and Islam. And so they come from a very, very small place, right? What they would call the Levant, right? What is now Israel, Syria, parts of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, all in those places, right, were the origin points of these, right? So a relatively small part of the world that is not the West has largely defined the West, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we're going to start with Judaism tonight. And if you got a handout, there's not a lot written on it, but there's a lot of space. That's purposeful, right? Because I want you to write a lot, hopefully, right? I want you to take notes. It's better for you to write it than for me to write it and you look at it, right? You'll retain more that way. And so I also want to ask this question. Why do we do nights like this? Okay, hopefully. Yeah, our faith is part of that for sure. Anybody else? Why do you think we do these nights? Okay, anything that we study that is centered around God should be valuable, absolutely. Anything else? Teaching? Okay. All right, learning's a good thing. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I hope sometimes I am. But for me, it really is about curiosity. I would hope that we as people of faith are curious people. Like, and I'm going to say this, and please, if this bothers you, that's okay. It's just my opinion. It's not a fact. But I have opinions, and right now I have a mic, and I can use that. So I think one of the conditions that we find ourselves in as a country is because we've become less curious and more certain. And by certain, I don't mean that we're actually certain. I mean that we have stopped actually being curious. One of the reasons we've been going through an Ecclesiastes, we've been focused on a wisdom series, is because I don't think that we are a people that really value wisdom anymore. When we talk about pursuit of wisdom, what we're generally talking about now is I'm looking for people who will affirm what I believe. Wisdom is not the pursuit of affirmation. Wisdom is the pursuit of truth. Right? And there's an old saying like that, truth will set you free, but it'll make you mad first. And I'm convinced one of the great rebellions we can be, one of the great countercultural kind of movements we can be as the church, is to really be curious and to call out places where people are trying to diminish curiosity and trying to insist on certainty. Does that make sense at all? I was thinking about this weekend. It was sparked by a conversation I had with somebody, and they were complaining about the political. I know you guys are tired of that too. If you're not, I'm not sure why you're not. But this person was talking to me about it, and they said, they're socialist and they're communist. And I thought to myself, well, those are two different systems. And it was apparent that the person was using words they did not know what they meant. We are in a critical moment culturally where people use words all the time that they have no idea what they mean. And I think, especially when it comes to faith, we should be people who are curious and want to know exactly what it is we're talking about. And I'm endlessly curious, that's just my personality. I want to know things. But it really does, I really struggle with how many people I see who just kind of take faith from somebody else and they never really think about it themselves very much. And so my hope is that we're working to create a culture where people question a whole lot, not because they're cynical, but because they're curious. And I'm a huge believer that when the Bible says that God rewards those who diligently seek Him, That's true. That he rewards those who, the word is diligent. What does diligent mean? Keep going. The ones who don't stop seeking him. In every capacity of life, intellectually, emotionally, in relationship, all of that. Right? And so for me, these nights are not only an exercise for myself to learn more about these things, because I have to, right? Some I know a little bit about, some I don't know very much about. So I'm spending time being curious about them, studying them. But my hope is that you didn't just come for answers. My hope is that you came to have your curiosity stoked. Because I'm not going to have all the answers for any of this. I don't have them for myself even. But I hope that by questioning, you will start to question. Not in a rebellious way, not in a way that's like, oh, I don't trust the system. Hopefully you have a little bit of that too. But hopefully some of it is like, man, I really want to know this, back to what Charlotte said. Because knowing more about this helps me know more about my Creator. And it helps me better understand my place in the creation. Those are good things. Those are good things, right? I would submit to you that tonight we're studying two different religions, and they're only two of many. They're major religions. But the fact that we have different major religions says what? Say it again. That people don't always arrive at the questions, the same answers, out of the same questions. That if we're not really diligently seeking out truth, it's easy to get caught in deception. And we live in a cultural moment of that. Rather than seeking and being wisdom and truth, people have just leaned into what scratch their ears, is the way the Bible talks about it. Itching ears, all you want is somebody to scratch it. For me, these nights are an exercise in reminding myself to be curious. That God does not balk at our questions. I think he balks when we fail to have them. At least he does for me. And so, that may not be why you're here at all, and that's fine, but I hope that tonight it provokes questions. And if you have questions that we don't get to answer tonight, my office is right down the hallway. You can call. You can text me. I'm glad to answer whatever I can. If I don't have an answer, I'll tell you that. And I'll do my best to find one. All right? So, let's talk about Judaism. How old is Judaism? Anybody have any ideas? It's the oldest of the three, right? Quite a bit older than the other two. A little bit more. So Abraham is probably about 1,800 years BC. Somewhere in that neighborhood. So about 3,800 years, you're looking at Abraham, probably in that scope of time somewhere. So, Judaism is somewhere between about 3,800 years. Somewhere in that neighborhood probably, right? So it's old. It's very, very, very old. Much older than probably any lingering religious system, right? Maybe other than Zoroastrianism, which may be a little bit older. But anyway, that's a whole other subject. They would date it from that, largely. So the Jews would date it from the patriarch, largely. And so in terms of the advent of the religious system, there are a lot of different dates within there. But they would hold that the belief system began with Abraham the patriarch. So for me, I think we owe it to kind of go by their date just a little bit, not ours, right? So yeah, going from Abraham probably would be a good starting point because that's where they would look at it as, at least as well as I understand that. So So about 4,000 years. It's not just a religion, it's also a cultural system at some level, right? It's defined not just within the religious practice, but also the culture of the people, right? And so that's kind of where they see it beginning. Both their beginning as a people is the beginning of the faith system, the beginning of the culture itself, because it's the beginning of a people. Any idea where the Jewish people most likely came from? What people did they descend from? Not Egyptians. All right, get ready to write this down. Most likely they were a Canaanite tribe. Most likely they descended from the same people groups that the Canaanites did, right? So in that same kind of sphere of people. Those were a lot of tribes. It wasn't a homogenous people, but they probably were some drifting tribe within the Canaanite system at some level. So it's interesting that their major, their major enemy becomes largely who? Early it was the Canaanites, right? And you know this, nobody fights like family. Right, so if some people has this new system, they think they're better than you all of a sudden. Yeah, the Canaanites are probably a little upset. So, but that's most likely where they come from in terms of derivative, right? In that area and all those kind of things. So it is that covenant that we see in Genesis 17 that kind of establishes, or it shapes the foundation of Jewish law, values, traditions. Those things have been passed down through generations, through that long succession of years. They've had a profound influence not just on those people who identify as Jewish, but also other religions, especially Christianity and Islam. The Christianity and Islam both draw heavily from Judaism in different ways, right? And so it's been very formative in those. So tonight we're going to kind of look at Judaism's origins. We're going to look at a couple of historic milestones, and then we'll kind of conclude with looking at some Jewish practice and beliefs, trying as best we can to provide a comprehensive overview of this rich and enduring faith. So, number 3, we'll go to the origins of Judaism just a little bit. So looking at geographical and temporal roots, as we already talked about, it originated in the ancient Near East, and that is actually a term that historians use, the ancient Near East. You might see it referred to as the Levant or the Levant as well, but it's that area kind of in the Middle East today that we would know as Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine is part of that, right? All in those areas, up into Iraq and Iran in certain places, but kind of that crossroads, which was a very significant area, even though it's very small, because of the trade routes that moved through it, right? That there were heavy trade routes, and so there was a lot of money to be made in that area over time. And so it was a very strategic point, and that is the place. And it also was very diverse in that way, right? A lot of different peoples were passing through those areas. And so there was a lot of interaction of cultures. There was a lot of changing of empire in that area over time. Persians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, all of these empires at one time had claim over that over time. So a lot of different influence coming into that, but also going out of Judaism towards those over time. We talked about this a little bit. This is kind of the earliest Jewish communities, somewhere around 2000 BCE, right? So organizing around this, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BCE, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we talked about this a little bit, but we'll repeat it here. So central to the origins of Judaism is the figure of Abraham, who is often called the father of Judaism. As we've already talked a little bit about, according to Jewish tradition, Abraham entered into a covenant with God, which we see in Genesis 17. And in that, if you read it, God promised to make Abraham's descendants a great nation if they upheld certain beliefs and ethical practices. So understanding this covenant is fundamental in understanding the identity and the purpose of the Jewish people. Now, I think it's important to kind of say this here. The promise came before the covenant. The promise that they were God's people came before the covenant was given. So what does that mean? They weren't God's people because they kept the covenant. because they were God's people, they were called to keep the covenant. Does that make a difference? So that's important to understand. It's important for us to understand as Christians, right? Because that covenant also influences the covenant that we have under Jesus. That we are his people because of what he did, not because we keep it well. Does that make sense? Do when we look at the Jews and say, well, they just didn't keep the covenant, so they were no longer. No, they were God's people anyway. The covenant just established what it looked like to live as God's people. We are the people of God as followers of Jesus, not because we follow him well, but because this new covenant, according to him, was what? It was brought about with his blood. That his blood is the mechanism of covenant for us, not that we keep it well, all right? And so they're the covenant people, and the covenant is meant not only for them to glorify God in it, but they're meant to live under the covenant so that all the nations of the world will know that he is God. They became the people of God so that all people could become the people of God. Right? That is key to understanding the covenant. That God chose this people not because he wasn't choosing everybody else, but that through this people they were supposed to make him known to everyone else. And if they failed at that in many ways. Right? Which is why when Jesus came, he said, I'm bringing a better covenant. Right? One that's not just built around an ethnic group, but it's for all people. Right? And so we see that in early Genesis under the idea of the covenant. All right? So they trace it themselves back to Abraham, right? And through Isaac, through Sarah, through that miracle that God brought about of a child being born to them in their old age. All right? So let's talk about the Hebrew Bible just a little bit. So the Hebrew Bible is called, you may know, that's a Torah is part of it. The Tanakh. The Tanakh, right? So it's the primary sacred text of Judaism. It's divided into three parts. The Torah, which is the law, right? Means the law. The Nevi'im, the prophets. And then the Ketuvim, which is the writings, right? So similar to our Old Testament. Those three sections contain all the stories, the law, the prophecies, and the wisdom literature that guide Jewish faith and practice. So the Tanakh, which contains those three sections, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So the Torah comprises the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And these texts narrate the creation of the world, the story of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and the law and commandments that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, which are central to Jewish law. So everything built around Jewish law, Jewish tradition, comes largely from, or mainly from, the Torah, those first 5 books. Beyond the written Tanakh, you also have oral tradition. So the collection of interpretations and discussions that were oral were eventually compiled into something called the Talmud. And the Talmud, in some sense, is a supplementary to the Tanakh, right? It's an explanation over time of all of these things and kind of an extrapolation of that. So you have largely the Tanakh and the Talmud. So it serves also as a foundational text that guides the practical and ethical aspects of Jewish life. So in the Talmud, we find basically how are we to live this in many ways. Any questions before we get to history of Judaism? And I know I'm running through this. I get it. There's a lot to cover, though. No questions? Man, I'm doing great. Or awful. Or awful. Either way. All right. So let's go to the history of Judaism just a little bit. So obviously, a key in kind of understanding this would be the patriarchs. Also some matriarchs there. But largely, we talk about it under the auspice of the patriarchs. So the foundational stories of Judaism center largely on the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Those three would be key and primary. Within those stories, you also see some matriarchal figures: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. And those are really key to understanding this because their lives, their journeys, they reflect the values of faith and perseverance and trust in God. So they're great examples of what it means to follow God, to trust in God, right? That they are not only these key historical figures, but they're great examples in terms of their stories. So beyond that, we get the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, and then of Moses leading the people. And certainly one of the defining events in Jewish history is the Exodus from Egypt, where God brings his people out of slavery. It was during kind of this coming out of slavery, this Exodus, that God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai, which is a pivotal moment that establishes the core ethical laws of Judaism. So the core ethics of Judaism really come with the giving of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. So if you know this story, after wandering in the desert, the Israelites finally, they settle in Canaan, which is called the Promised Land. God said, this is the land that I promised you. I promised Abraham this. I'm going to give it to you. This era was marked by the rule of judges. So it was a system of leadership that guided the early Israelite tribes before they had kings. Later, Israel becomes a kingdom under leaders like Saul, David, Solomon, who actually built the first temple in Jerusalem. And at that point, Jerusalem becomes the spiritual center of Jewish life, as does the temple within it. So kind of the defining moments of early Jewish history, the period of the Judges. You have conquest during that time, right? When they go into Canaan, it's not finished. They have to continue to fight and conquest, go through conquest of different parts of that. It's one of the places, if you ever read those accounts in the Old Testament, they're brutal, right? If you've ever read that history, it's brutal. That God basically tells them to wipe out everybody, right? People say, well, that seems genocidal, but then you read the rest of the story, you realize they didn't actually wipe out everybody. That it seems like some hyperbole in places there. And so the period of the Judges, they ask for a king. What does God say? You don't want a king. You have a king. Your king is me. They're like, yeah, but we want a king we can see. And he's like, all right, you get it. And it goes bad from the beginning, right? Be careful of asking for kings you can see. Be careful of asking for kings you can see. It cost them a lot, right? So they get these kings and it goes really bad, and every once in a while it gets a little good, but mostly it's really, really bad. And then eventually what happens? They go back into slavery. That God brought them out of slavery and he puts them right back in it. To different empires, right? They become not much of anything, pretty insignificant in the region, honestly. Right? Because they refuse to follow God's way. They keep saying we can do things our way. It doesn't really work for them. All right? One of the key points of this period is the building of the first temple. And if it's called the first temple, why is it called that? Because it didn't last. Right? So they built this first temple. It's glorious, right? And it lasts for a little while, and then eventually it comes down. All right? And who does it come down under? Anybody know? Nope, that was the second temple. So the first temple goes down in about 586 BC, right? And it's when the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem. So the Babylonians come in, they take Jerusalem, they lay waste to the temple, they send most of the important people out of who are Jewish into exile, right? The Babylonians were really good at that. They would spread everybody out, those they didn't kill. And so we have the fall of the temple, and you have what they call the Babylonian exile during this period. So this exile is kind of a transformational event in the history of Judaism. It's still remembered greatly. And it did a couple of things. It forced the Jewish community to adapt to their worship, and to maintain their identity without a central temple. So some things had to change within it. There was no longer this temple that everybody could go to, right? This kind of like picture of the glory of Yahweh, right? Of their God and their religion. So this really forced them to kind of do some different things during this period. So the Babylonians conquered them, then the Persians conquered Babylon, and they allowed the Jews to return and to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So they allow them to go back. They give them permission to rebuild the temple, which ushers in a new period. You may have any guess what this one's called? The Second Temple period. Right? You know why they call it that? Because they're going to rebuild the temple, right? They're going to have the Second Temple period. All right? Historians are not really fancy sometimes. They're just like, oh, they built a Second Temple, we'll call it the Second Temple period. So this period saw significant religious development, including the formalization of Jewish texts and rituals. So a lot of the current Jewish text that makes up the Tanakh is actually from this period. So a lot of the manuscripts that even we have, right, originate from this period, post-exile. So they're much, much more recent to us than we typically think. Most of the texts that we have engagement with in the Bible are somewhere 600 BC. So think about that. When were Abraham and Moses on the scene? Much earlier than 600. When were most of the writings that we have written down? 600 and later. I say all that just to say it's important that we know where the things that we hold true come from. That we're not holding on to these illusions because they help us in our head be more secure with it. That most of the biblical writings are relatively late. Does that make them less true? Not at all. But it also doesn't help us to act like that's not where they're from, right? That a lot of the prior writings, the manuscripts before that, were largely burned during the temple and the conquest by the Babylonians. They would have burned all of that stuff. So it's in the post-exile period when they come back and they're able to write these things down, largely from oral tradition or maybe some remnants that they had from that. All right? So the Second Temple period is a very important period for Jewish history. All right? Other than that, without the temple, Jewish communities developed what we know as synagogues. And synagogues are just gathering places. They weren't buildings to begin with, right? It was just a place because they didn't have a temple that local communities would gather together to go through worship, to go through different religious rites and festivals and things like that during that time. And synagogues to this day remain central to Jewish worship, right? So that's something that developed in this period that has carried on and remains hugely important within Jewish worship and faith. All right, which brings us to the diaspora and rabbinic Judaism. It's funny, my wife asked me this the other day, this question, and it had nothing to do with this. She just asked me out of nowhere. I don't know, do you guys get these questions? I walked in the room, she's like, what does diaspora mean? I'm like, why? That seems weird. And it's because she's teaching it in social studies at school, right? So she's like, what does this word mean? I was like, what do you think it means? Because that's always my first question to people. What do you think it means? Anybody have any idea? What does diaspora mean? Say it again? Okay, yeah, spreading out, a dispersion, right? So in this case, purposely spreading out of people, right? As a way of kind of diminishing them, as a way of kind of trying to control them and to keep them from rising up against you. So the diaspora that we're thinking about here happens in about 70 AD or CE, right? 70 after death. So the Romans destroy the Second Temple. And as part of that, they instigate and cause a widespread Jewish diaspora, which sends people across the Mediterranean beyond. So this is a key point because it really alters the structure of Jewish life. Again, as communities adapted to living without a physical center. So again, you had these community synagogues and the Second Temple that had become again kind of a key point in Jewish life, but also kind of something that they looked to as very, very important. And again, it's taken away. The Romans burn it and do a ton of damage within there. Some horrific things done in that period to the Jewish community. And this, again, has a tremendous effect on Judaism moving forward. So as the temple was no longer accessible, what we would refer to as rabbinic Judaism emerged. So this form of Judaism emphasized study, prayer, ethical living, and it was largely guided by the teachings of rabbis rather than temple sacrifices. Because there's no temple, there's no more sacrifice. Right? There's no ritualistic sacrifice, and so there's a shift in the form of Judaism where it becomes more about ethical teaching, how do we live, all of those kind of things, rather than this ritualistic kind of faith that it had been largely under the Second Temple period. All right? So that's going to take us into Judaism in Europe, kind of in the Middle Ages. Any question? We've covered a lot of years and a lot of stuff here. Any questions? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would not call it the third temple. The third temple for them, it will be the Messianic temple. He did. They would not consider the Herodian temple a temple in that way. The Herodians were not well respected among the Jewish population. They were in bed with the Romans. They oppressed the Jews more than just about any Romans. And so the third temple, when you hear Jews talk about the third temple is the expectation of the Messianic temple largely. That's the one that will be rebuilt when the Messiah comes and sets up the kingdom and restores Israel to its place. So, but yes, there was a Herodian version of the temple, absolutely. But most of them would not refer to it in that way, at least my understanding. And I'm not sure that they ever sacrificed in Herod's temple. That was still the second temple at that point. The second temple was burned in 70 AD. So when did Jesus live? Absolutely. So he was still sacrificing in the second temple. Or at least that was where he was engaged in. Any other questions? None? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Judaism. It kind of spreads because of the diaspora. So we have something that they would call the Golden Age, which is kind of through the Middle Ages, right? So for instance, in medieval Spain, you had Jewish communities that thrived culturally and intellectually. They contributed greatly to philosophy, medicine, poetry. This period of peace and prosperity allowed Jewish thought to really flourish, not only in Spain, but in many parts of Europe. So in this same period, the Middle Ages, Jewish communities in Europe faced persecution. There were forced conversions by the church and expulsions, including the expulsion from Spain in 1492. So in the same year that Columbus is sailing to the New World, Spain was throwing out Jews. You got to go, right? Either convert or go. And so we see periods of this throughout not only Spain, but almost all of Europe. Rabid anti-Semitism in the 13, 14, 15, 1600s. It didn't just happen in the 1900s. Those things have been happening for centuries. And it culminated in many ways in the 30s and 40s, right? that Hitler and his cronies built upon a long legacy of hate. And I will say, if you pay attention in the West right now, there are people trying to bring this language back up. There are people right now, if you get on social media platforms, who are trying to again use things like Palestine and Israel or other things to really raise the head of anti-Semitism on a large scale and a large level again. And this is where, as followers of Jesus, I feel like we have to be people who speak truth to those lies. We have to give no quarter, no space to that kind of thought. And certainly that kind of action. Right? And if you don't exist in those spaces, good for you. Stay out of them. But there are Christian movements right now that are pushing anti-Semitism in a heavy way in the U.S. Most of them in Idaho. Bringing up blood libel, if you know what blood libel is, that the Jews killed Jesus. And they deserve to die because they killed our king. These are tropes from the 13 and 1400s that have never died. And every generation there are a couple of idiots or psychopaths who bring them back up for their own benefit. And I just say that because my sense is that these things are not going to diminish around us, they're actually going to increase. Because when you have a population that is guided by fear, you have to have a demon. You have to have an enemy. It's another reason we do nights like this. That hopefully before you ever hear of these things, we've already talked about them. So you can see the wolves. Because there are wolves. One of the things I love about my role is that occasionally, shepherds carry sticks for a reason, right? Sometimes you got to beat a wolf. Right? Luckily, I haven't come across a whole lot personally. But we have to be willing to combat wolves and not pretend that we can play nicely with people that want to eat us. We want to diminish Jesus in that way. All right? So enough said on that. If you have more questions about it, come ask me. But there are people who are right now trying to redo this. And it's disgusting. And somebody needs to hit them with something.
Is there some place in the Bible that predicts what's going on right now? Because what's going on right now, it seems that's a big piece of history.
Yeah, I think what the Bible predicts more than specific moments is it predicts patterns of behavior that are consistent and that repeat themselves. And so I think what we're seeing now is a continued progression of human history. That when we turn to our own ways, it ends with violence and murder and hatred and all of these things. Right? The interesting thing is all through history you've had these dramatic moments. If you go back and you really think about World War II, and that was before I was born, so I wasn't there, even before my parents were really born. Right? My dad was born in 42. My mom was born in 44. But I can remember my grandpa who was born, I want to say around 1911 or something like that, 1912, somewhere in that. I had another grandpa who was born in 1894. So he lived until I was 9. And drove with me in his car until I was about 8, which was crazy. But I can remember one of my grandfathers was not religious at all until on his deathbed, right? The older one. My other grandfather was very religious, very involved in his little church in his little farm town. But I can remember him talking and telling stories when I was young about during the outbreak of World War II, and even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, how you had people saying, oh, Jesus is coming, look at it. Every time something great happens globally, we start thinking that way. Now, here's what's going to happen. Eventually, somebody's going to be right about it. Eventually, the percentages are going to pay off. But every generation has said it. So I tend to think that what the Bible is trying to show is like patterns of behavior. That historically, we're no different. Our technology is a little bit better, but we're the same. And so, I'm a big believer. I try to live my life like Jesus. If he came today, I'm glad. If I die before he comes, I'm glad. Right? And try not to read myself into the story too much. You know what I mean? Right? I think sometimes if we're not careful, we read ourselves into the story a little bit too much. And that can be problematic. So, yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see that in Nehemiah, all of those kind of things, right? Mm-hmm. 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 I would say a lot of Judaism, the predominant numbers of Judaism are probably um, more just ethnically or culturally Jewish than they are religiously, right? The predominant kind of section of Judaism in the U.S. would be Reform Judaism, which is largely just cultural Judaism. They might go to temple occasionally. They're not practicing Shabbat in the same way. They're not doing those things consistently. It's just a cultural kind of connection. There are movements within Israel and without even a little bit of Orthodox Judaism and hyper-Orthodox Judaism that are very much pushing for the rebuilding of the temple, right? Who are going to the lengths of, breeding cattle so that they can have a red heifer, all of that stuff, right? They're just pretty refined and they don't have a lot of power right now. And the big holdup would be the Temple Mount, right? The big holdup would be that you've got the Dome of the Rock, the mosque, sitting on the Temple Mount, right? So in order to get that, to rebuild the temple, because they're not just going to build it any place, you got to take the Dome of the Rock down, which is going to be that's not going to go well. Of course, to them, and I think you see that within Israeli politics. They do have some seats in the Knesset and those things, right? So it's like, I think they're working, right? It would almost be like Christian nationalism in the U.S. There's some loud voices, just most people don't hear them. What I was talking about earlier with the anti-Semitism, a lot of that is Christian nationalist rhetoric in certain specs. And so for most of you, I said that, and most of you are like, what? Where? But if you're paying attention, it's there. And they're biding their time. They're trying to work through the governmental system to get to a place where they can invoke it. And I think the same thing's happening in Israel largely. That they know they don't have the numbers to overthrow government and to move this forward. They don't have those numbers. So I think they're strategically trying to work through the governmental system, gain seats, and eventually get to a point where they can force issues, right? I think you have a lot of similarities between the Christian nationalist movement here and kind of the ultra-Orthodox movement in Jerusalem or in Israel at this point. Now, they hate each other, don't get me wrong. Like, they can't stand each other. But there's some similarities in the movements, I think, the way they're trying to get to power, right? Because they don't have the numbers to just come at people. They don't have those numbers at all. But it is a definite movement. And they're not shy about telling you what they want either. Right? And I think that's, to be honest with you, I think that's part of the challenge of, so for instance, Netanyahu, does he keep going in Gaza and now in Lebanon? Why does he keep engaging in this? Some people would say, well, it's because they have no choice. I think he does have choices. But I think part of it is he's trying to balance this really uneasy peace in his own country. Because you've got ultra-Orthodox people who want to destroy all of them so that they can get back to the temple. And you got really Reformed people who are like, why are we doing this? This isn't who we want to be. So I think a lot of it's internal struggle. And he's trying to figure out, it's a pretty complex situation, I think. Which is why when people talk about it in simple terms, it gets I get a little uneasy because I'm like, oh, there's a whole lot going on there. And a lot of it's internal politics stuff that I don't fully understand. And I don't think most Americans have any concept of, or certainly don't fully understand. So I think Netanyahu's just trying to survive, honestly, at some level. Yes, sir? Sure. Good. Don't try to get familiar with it. Sure. Yep. They would say they're more theonomist than theocratic, but it's just revamping a word. So they believe in a separation of church and state at some level. So they don't want priests ruling the country, pastors, whatever. They want Christian, what's the word they use? Man, my mind doesn't work like it used to. I'll think of the word in about 10 minutes. But they basically want only people to be able to hold office who are Christian. And so they want the church to guide those statesmen. And I say statesmen for a reason because they don't think any women. Like there's huge calls right now to repeal the 19th Amendment in that community. Right? There's some craziness there. So yeah, so they would call themselves theonomists because they don't think the church should be the same as the state, but the church should tell the state how to operate in theonomy. Right? So imagine, if you guys missed the last American church history presentation, imagine Massachusetts when it started. And if you don't know about Massachusetts when it started, go read up on it. That you can be in our colony if you believe what we believe, and if you go to church, they literally would put you in jail for not going to worship services in Massachusetts. They had anti-heresy laws. If somebody heard you say something they didn't like, or to disparage the clergy, they would put you in the stocks, put you in jail. If you weren't Puritan, they largely would exile you to another colony. So, if you ever hear a real person who really believes in this idea of Christian nationalism, they always will refer to the Puritans. Because Massachusetts, they think, was a good idea. I highly disagree with them. I think Massachusetts was a bad idea. Right? And we talked about this in the American history thing last week. You can go back and watch if you want to. Among the first 13 colonies, 8 of them had specifically religious charters. Out of the 8, there were 5 different religions. All Christian, but they could not stand each other. Maryland was Catholic. Pennsylvania was largely Quaker. Right? New York was mainly Dutch Reformed. Massachusetts was largely puritanical. Right? And then you had some Anglican. Right? The first was, what was the first? Virginia? And it was Anglican? It's always funny. I always think because the Christian nationalists will say, well, we were founded as a Christian nation. Were we? Because what kind of nation were they leaving? It was Christian. England was officially Christian. And they're like, well, they were leaving the Anglican church. Well, that's interesting because the first colony was Anglican. So maybe, just maybe, all the stories we heard were a little more involved than we heard them. Right? Which is why I want you to be curious. That people play upon things when we don't really pursue understanding them. Right? I'm not sure how we got from Judaism to early American. That was a weird pivot on my part. I'm not sure how I got there. I apologize. So let's go into Judaism in the modern era. So really thinking about the period of the Enlightenment. So in the 18th century, the European Enlightenment encouraged Jews to largely integrate into broader society. So we saw new movements arise like what we would consider Reform Judaism, which adapted traditions to modern life. So we see a little bit of that movement in the Enlightenment that Jews were also affected by that period of time, right? Where there was more of an increase in knowledge, science, depending on those kind of things, rather than just faith, right? So that had effect within Judaism, not just within Christianity. So moving on through that, we have obviously a huge period, or a huge pivotal point for Judaism, the Holocaust, or the Shoah, which was obviously a devastating chapter. Estimates are 6 million Jews that were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. 6 million Jews, I don't know if you guys know this, but probably about 11 million people total. They didn't just kill Jews. They killed all kinds of people who they felt like didn't fit. Back to our Christian nationalism. When you just start declaring people you don't belong here, there's only two ways to get rid of them. It's generally more cost efficient to kill them than it is to send them. So beware of Christian or any religious faith that says, oh, those people don't belong. Because what comes next, historically, is always horrific. Right? And the Jewish population in Europe largely saw that through the Nazis. Right? So this tragedy obviously had a profound impact on Jewish identity and really rallied and led to global support for a Jewish homeland. That had been in movement before the Holocaust through the British, right? Because the British were trying to get out of some of those areas. And before it was Israel, it was British Palestine. Palestine is actually a Roman word. It comes from the Romans. The Romans used that word about the area first, and it actually referred to Jews in the area. So again, studying history helps understand context just a little bit. All right? So in 1948, the modern state of Israel was established, giving Jews a sovereign nation. And obviously for many Jews worldwide, Israel represents a cultural, religious center connecting them to their ancient heritage. So that's kind of a history of Israel from the patriarchs to the modern state. Any questions before we go on to some of the core practices? So is modern Israel I'm going to ask a question. You don't have to have an answer. When you think of the modern state of Israel, do you think of biblical Israel? Are they the same? In the way that God perceives them? The modern Israeli state, are those still God's chosen people as they were in the Old Testament under the name Israel? Are they? Okay. I'm talking the state itself, and everyone within the state. Agree. Absolutely agree. I don't have a good answer for it. Which is why I do get a little nervous when people have an absolute answer for it. Right? And so I think it's something to think about. I think it's something to, I think it gets really scary when we try to use the Bible to justify support for the state of Israel. I think we go a little far with that sometimes. Not that we should or shouldn't support them. I don't know that there's a clear biblical reason for us to support the modern state of Israel that way. And you may disagree with me entirely, and that's fine. Like I said, I don't have a sure sense of that. But I do get a little nervous when other people have a sure sense of it. Right? And if you think I'm heretical, I apologize. I don't think it is, but yes, sir, go ahead. Sure. Yeah. I think a lot of it, I think there are different reasons for that, right? Like, I think there are people who, I know a lot of these people, and I may have been at this point at some point in my life, honestly, who are like, well, they're God's people, and so we have to protect that. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. Honestly, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. So I can understand the side of people who say, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I can see that a little bit. I can see some people who push back against that too. I get that too. So I think pragmatically, we like having a democracy in the Middle East, right? And so that's important pragmatically to me, right? I get that. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think most people think about it in various capacities. I know I grew up in a tradition where everybody supported Israel because the Bible says, basically, you'll be blessed if you do. So everybody wanted to be blessed. You know what I mean? And I always felt like that was a little weird. It's like, I'm not even sure you like them. You just want to be blessed. So that's odd. So I don't know. Anyway, it's a question I have. I'm trying to figure it out. Right? What I did not say, let me get this on video, is that I don't support them or that I don't understand that. What I said is, for me, sometimes I see a lot of people use the Bible to make a claim that I'm not sure it does. And I always get a little suspect about that. Not just on that, but on anything, right? I'm always like, where are you coming from on that? So, anyway. All right. So let's go to core beliefs and practices. So as we said, Judaism is monotheistic. So at the heart of Judaism is the belief in one God, a unique and all-powerful deity. This concept of ethical monotheism shapes Jewish ethic and morality. So monotheism is an incredibly vital and important part of Jewish belief, right? Is this idea of there is one God, right? Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, right? The Shema. And so in the prayers, you will hear that repeated. It's such an integral part of the Jewish identity, this idea of being monotheistic, one God, Yahweh, right? This creator God. So beyond that, you have ethical laws, what they would call the mitzvah, right? So there are 613 mitzvah or commandments, and they cover a range of ethical and ritual law. They include the 10 Commandments, and obviously we're mostly familiar with those, which outline principles such as honoring one's parents, avoiding theft, respecting other people. In terms of community and family, Judaism places a strong emphasis on family and community. Jewish life centers around home rituals, synagogue services, and community observances, which helps to create a real shared religious and cultural identity. So very communal, very family-oriented. Those are key components of it, right? That it's not an individualistic religion in that way. It's very communal, right? That you don't just participate yourself. You participate with your family, right? You participate with your community, all of those kind of things. So a couple of Jewish holidays and festivals. So Passover, Pesach. And Passover commemorates the exodus from Egypt. It's celebrated with a ritual meal called a Seder, where symbolic foods and prayers recount the story of liberation. You also have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. So the Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement are known as the High Holy Days. These are times given to reflection, prayer, seeking forgiveness. Hanukkah, if you've ever had Jewish friends, you might have been around during Hanukkah. What does Hanukkah celebrate? It's not Christmas. So during the Maccabean revolt under the Romans, there was a miracle where the oil lasted for 8 days and it only should have lasted for one in the lamp of the temple, right? Or at least that's the tradition. And so Hanukkah is 8 days long because it celebrates the 8 days that God provided oil for the lamps in the temple, the lamp of the temple, right? So Hanukkah is a celebration of that. Families light a menorah, celebrate with traditional foods and games. And then Shabbat, or the Sabbath, is a kind of a key point. Shabbat's the weekly day of rest. It's observed from Friday evening to Saturday evening. It's a time for prayer, rest, and family gatherings, underscoring the importance of renewal and reflection. So depending on kind of where they find themselves, people may celebrate it in extreme measures or almost not at all, right? If you celebrate it as a very Orthodox Jew, you can do almost nothing on those days, right? If you're in Israel, you go into some buildings in Israel on Shabbat, literally you go into an elevator, all the buttons are lit up. The elevator will stop on every floor every time because pushing a button would be considered breaking Shabbat, right? So you get from that level to people who don't really celebrate it at all if they're Reformed maybe, right? Or celebrate in a very minimal way. So there's a huge spectrum of how they celebrate these things and what it means to them, all right? So a couple of worship and ritual things to keep in mind. We talked a little bit about this already, but the idea of the synagogue, the centrality of it, it's the center of Jewish worship, as it has been, without a temple. Most synagogues will have an ark or an Aron Kodesh, and in that they will have the Torah scrolls, and those really, around that, it serves as a place for community gatherings and study, is what the synagogue kind of becomes their central place of gathering. So prayer and daily rituals. Observant Jews, or Orthodox Jews at least, will often pray 3 times a day, often reciting the Shema, which is from Deuteronomy 6, which is a declaration of faith in the one God. They would also generally abide by dietary laws known as kashrut, which guide eating practices, and those are meant to reinforce mindfulness and respect for creation. And then in terms of life events that they hold very dearly, some of those you may be familiar with, including important rituals for birth, Brit Milah, coming of age, which we know as bar or bat mitzvah, right, depending on if it's a boy or a girl, and then marriage, and certainly mourning is also a big part of the Jewish community, communal mourning, and a period of that. So all of those mark significant transitions, and they really are meant to foster community support around families. So we talked a little bit about Judaism today, a couple of kind of main points of what we would consider denominations or branches of Judaism. So you'll see things such as Orthodox Jews, right, which traditionally you'll know that by their dress, and they tend to adhere very strictly to traditional law. You would have what we would consider conservative Judaism, which is kind of a mix of Orthodox and Reform in that it balances tradition and modernity. So there's some tradition built within it, but it also, they're probably not wearing ritualistic garments out in public and those kind of things, right? It kind of tries to mix between how do we live in this world and how do we maintain tradition, right, as well. And then lastly, Reformed Judaism, which we talked about, which really emphasizes individual autonomy and interpreting Jewish principles. So this is basically cultural Judaism largely, right? Or how does the individual interpret this? How do they want this to be part of their life? So there's a lot of autonomy within that. You have some newer movements like Reconstructionist Judaism, which focuses on evolving Jewish practices, while secular Judaism values cultural identity over religious observance. So if you're a secular Jew, it basically is just your ethnicity, your culture. There's not a whole lot of religious practice to it at all. So a huge spectrum. We see that not just within Judaism, we see it within Christianity as well. Right? You got people who are very adamant about their faith. You've got people that come to church once a year. Right? So within all faiths, you have this spectrum of participation and belief in those kind of things. So, all right. That's Judaism in an hour and 10 minutes. Doug.
How is salvation, how would a Jew look at salvation?
So the covenant people are those who agree to abide by the covenant. So if you're born into an ethnic Jewish family, you're expected to abide by those covenant rituals, those covenant guidelines, right? The interesting thing about even the Old Covenant and the Old Testament is that it wasn't just for those who were born Jewish. You had people who became Jews, right? Rahab. Others who were welcomed in the community. A Jew was even then anyone who was willing to live under the covenant. And so it's the same thing today, right? You might be born under the covenant, you still have to live by it, under it. You have to practice it in some regard. And depending within Judaism, there are different views of the afterlife. Not all of them believe in an afterlife, right? And they have different developed senses of that. So a lot of it just depends on kind of the strictness of what you grew up in. I would say on the Orthodox end, right? So Hasidic Jews, very like far side orthodoxy. There is a sense of like, do you abide by all these covenant guidelines? Do you live this? Have you been welcomed in the community, right? And if you don't, they banish you, right? So they'll throw you out. So for that side, it would be being part of the community, being recognized as part of the community, abiding by the guidelines and the covenant laws in a way that the community allows you to remain part of the community, right? And if you're not born into that, it's a very difficult process to get into it, right? There's a lot involved in that, being brought into that. You can do it, it's just very involved. And so I think it depends on where you find yourself on the spectrum just a little bit. Yep. Yes, ma'am? Mm-hmm. It depends on where she came out of in Judaism, honestly. Like I said, there are still relatively large sects of Judaism that don't necessarily have a belief in an afterlife. Right? Or if they do, it's kind of a resurrection kingdom, kind of similar to what we would think about, that Israel's going to be brought back to prominence, and at some level there's a resurrection there. Right? But there's a huge spectrum of belief within it. So, yeah, I mean, if she's raised in a period where really there's not a lot of certainty about the afterlife and what it looks like, I can understand being hopeless in that. I mean, if you think about it, it wasn't really even very settled by the time of Jesus in the Jewish belief system. Right? So this idea that what we would talk about as heaven and hell that took a long time to get to. Right? Think about even in the two main groups that we know of, or that most people know of in the first century period of Jesus. Right? So the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Pharisees believed in an afterlife, the Sadducees didn't. So even by the time of Jesus, there wasn't like this firm, agreed upon belief of what an afterlife was like in Judaism. So a lot of it's unknown to them, right? Like, and so yeah, there's some uncertainty there. It's the same within Islam. We'll talk about that a little bit. Same within Islam. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Some are. I would say more of your Orthodox conservative. There's more of a sense of an afterlife there, that it will be kind of an eternal kingdom or a messianic kingdom, and so they believe that there will be a resurrection then, at the time of the Messiah. The intermediary is a little fuzzy for a lot of them, right? Like, so they would still believe in the idea of like a Hades, like a place of the dead, right? At some level, probably. So I think some do, right? Or at least the idea of a messianic kingdom and then a kind of a corresponding resurrection with that. But I think and I think a part of this is a product of coming out of something like the Holocaust. That a lot of Jews became very, very secular post-Holocaust. Because for them, it was hard to believe in the idea of being God's chosen people and walking through that. How could God's chosen people deal with this? So secular Judaism, Reformed Judaism grew exponentially 50s, 60s, 70s moving forward. Right? Because it was very hard for them to rationalize, I just lost my whole family and we're God's chosen people. What are you talking about? I can't believe in that kind of God then. So I think that's an ongoing struggle for a lot of people. How could God let this kind of thing happen? If I lost my whole family, I might feel the same way, honestly. I'd like to think I'd be better thinking about it, but I don't think I would. So, anything else on Judaism before we get into Islam? I know you guys are not interested in Islam very much, so we'll. All right, let's talk about Islam then. So when I use the word Islam, what do you think of? What comes to mind when we talk about Islam? Muslims, followers of Islam. Okay, so what they wear. What the women wear. Some of the women wear. Not all of them. Submit. Which is what the religion means. Submission. So the word itself means that, submission. Submission to Allah, to God. Which by the way, I don't know if you guys know this, but the word Allah is actually a derivation of the Hebrew word for God. It's not like an Arabic derivation of it. It actually evolves from the Hebrew, right? And in the Aramaic. In the Aramaic, it would have been pretty much Allah, right? So for them, when they use it, they're using what they consider the oldest version of the word, right, for God. So submission to Allah, right? Submission to God. So submission to this idea that God is in control of everything, and all I can do is submit to His greatness. That's what forms the religion, right? And we'll see how that kind of manifests just a little bit. So Islam is a monotheistic faith that emphasizes submission to the will of Allah, which is the term for God that they use exclusively. So its teachings encompass moral, social, and spiritual guidance based on the revelations to the Prophet Muhammad. So Islam is two things. It's a religion and it's also a way of living. You cannot disconnect those two. That it's both. It's not just a religious practice, it's the way that they are to live, right? And so we'll look a little bit at its history, its developments, then we'll talk a little bit about essential belief and practices that define Islam today. So, when did Islam originate? Anybody have any idea? So we said Judaism is 3,500, 3,800 years, somewhere in there. Christianity is about 2,000 years, right? Give or take a few, right? So, Judaism much older than Christianity. Islam originated about when? About, late 600s AD, right? So it's about 1,300 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood.
How would you explain? It seems like it grew so fast.
They did.
How would you what vacuum attracted those people to it? I mean, what were they missing? Did they come from places that had no religion?
No, no.
How were they taught to?
Pretty much every place had a religion.
I mean, how are Muslims made to believe that? I mean, what were they lacking in that part of the country? There had to be something missing.
Like the early part of it was, so the earliest days of Islam, and this is where it is different than Christianity, and this may not be, people might not like this, but historically it's true. Largely it grew through conquest. Forceful conquest early, right? And so that was the story of its early days, was forceful conquest, right? That if you read the Quran, right, that literally that's one of the implements that it utilizes. This is how we bring people into this, is they submit. Because again, what does the word mean? Submit. So as a believer, as one who is submitted to Allah, what am I called to do? Absolutely. Right? And that's not the way that it always works in the world that we live in. I'm not making that claim. And there are periods where it grew because of influence, and it grew because of some of the offerings it made that were not necessarily peaceful, but they were advantageous. But the earliest days, the way it got initial numbers was it largely spread through conquest, the sword, right? And got a foothold, and then there were golden ages and periods where it was peaceful, and there was a lot happening there that we benefit from even, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But it grew largely through the sword early, right? It was imposed upon people initially. So Islam originated in the Arabian Peninsula, somewhere in the early 7th century CE, primarily around the city of Mecca, which is in present-day Saudi Arabia, right? So this time period was characterized by polytheistic tribal societies and significant social and economic disparity. So it was a movement largely among the poor early, right? And it largely, in a lot of those areas, conquest was welcome because they overthrew tyrants. And they brought some equity to the society, if that makes sense. They actually lifted the poor, right? It paid attention to the poor. In the same way that Christianity did early, right? Christianity was a movement of the poor, as most religions are early, right? That they work from the bottom up, not the top down. And so Islam had a bit of that because it did pay attention to how poor people were treated, how outcasts were treated a little bit. And so it did have some advantages in places where largely the poor were seen as other than, right? And so it also had that bit of mechanism working for it. So obviously central to Islam is the Prophet, Muhammad. So his lifespan was from about 570 to 632 AD. So he lived to be about 62, 61, 62. He was born in Mecca, so in what now is Saudi Arabia, in about 570. He was orphaned at a young age. He was raised by his uncle, and he became known for his honesty and compassion, earning the title Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. So in 610, at the age of 40, Muhammad began receiving divine revelations from the angel Gabriel, which he would recite to his followers. And these revelations form the Quran, which is Islam's sacred text, primary sacred text. So the key concept of these messages that Muhammad received from Gabriel was the oneness of God, or the Ta'id, the oneness of God, one God, that everyone must submit to. So this doctrine of monotheism was a departure from the prevailing polytheistic beliefs in Mecca, and it emphasized God's unity, his justice, and his mercy. So he had an expectation of justness, and he was a merciful God, which would have been very different from most of their gods, right? Most of their gods demanded, they weren't merciful, right? So the Quran. The Quran, which means, anybody know what Quran means in Arabic? Recitation. So the recitation. So if you think about it, they believe it was delivered by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. It wasn't written down. He didn't write it down. He would go and then recite it. So the recitation that was received by Muhammad given to others, right, is considered the literal word of God revealed to Muhammad. So it's composed of 114 chapters or surahs, and they're arranged roughly from the longest to the shortest. So it starts long and it gets shorter. Obviously God, no, I'm not going to say that. It's funny to me, but it's probably not funny to everybody. God was getting tired towards the end. He's like, let's wrap this up. I shouldn't treat people's holy text like that. I apologize. So Muslims believe the Quran to be the final and complete revelation of God, building upon earlier scriptures like the Torah and the Gospels, but correcting any human errors or modifications. So they would give great respect to the Torah and to the Gospels. But they don't necessarily say they're without error or modification. They would say they're more modified than error. And what they would say is that, okay, humans took the Bible and they recorded it, and now it's been translated in all these other languages. How do you know that they did it perfectly? When you learn the Quran, you can only learn it in one language, Arabic. That if you go to a imam or you go to a school, an Arabic school, a school of Quran, there are no English versions of it. It's in Arabic. Why? Because it's how God spoke it to Muhammad. It's how Muhammad spoke it to his followers. That for them, that's the way it's protected as the Word of God. That for us, we're reading Bibles in English. That's not the Word of God. That's something that somebody wrote down, and yeah, they did their best. But how can you trust that? Right? And so, for them, the Quran is the final revelation of God and the complete revelation of God. The Torah is nice, the Gospels are great, but the Quran is final. Right? So in addition to the Quran, the Muslims also look to something called the Hadith, which are collections of sayings and actions of Muhammad. So these texts provide guidance on the practical application of Islamic teachings in daily life. The Hadith help clarify the meanings and context of Quranic verses and serve as a secondary source of law and moral guidance. So these are people writing later, scholars and imams writing later, explaining what Muhammad was trying to say or what he meant by that, right? So the Quran is the ultimate. The Hadiths are meant to be kind of explanatory, right? They don't hold quite the same cachet as the Quran does, but they are valued greatly, all right? So let's talk about a few key events in Muhammad's life. So the early Meccan period, when he's around Mecca. So Muhammad initially preached in Mecca, but his monotheistic message met resistance from Meccan leaders who saw it as a threat to their social order and economic interests tied to polytheistic pilgrimage. So they were afraid it was going to affect their pocketbook, so they sent him away. Hey, you can't do that here, right? So then he takes a hijrah to Medina, which is in 622. So in 622, Muhammad and his followers migrated to the city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina, in an event known as the Hijrah. So this migration marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar and represents a turning point where the Muslim community established a social and political base. So in Medina, Muhammad served as both a spiritual and a political leader. He united tribes and he established an Islamic community based on mutual support, justice, and faith. And after years of conflict, Muhammad and his followers returned to Mecca in 630 CE or AD and peacefully reclaimed the city, cleansing the Kaaba of idols and dedicating it to the worship of Allah alone. So he comes back to Mecca. He's got enough support. He takes over the city. He throws out all the idols, and he officially establishes kind of the central point of what is now kind of an Islamic faith. So he dies in about 632, and really Islam spreads heavily after his death. So from 632 to 661, there's something called the Rashidun Caliph. So after his death, his successors, known as the Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs, led the Muslim community. Under their leadership, Islam spread through the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. So kind of has this exponential growth during this almost 30-year period. So Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph, solidified Islam within Arabia. Under the next three caliphs, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, Islamic territories expanded rapidly into parts of the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires. So from 661 to 750, we have something called the Umayyad dynasty, which established Damascus as its capital and expanded Islam into North Africa, Spain, and parts of Central Asia. So you can see in about the first 120 years, it's expanded pretty exponentially. It's grown large in terms of land mass. From 750 to about 1250, so about 500 years, we have something called the Abbasid dynasty, which was based in Baghdad. And this is really known as the golden age of Islamic culture, where there are huge advancement in science, medicine, literature, and philosophy. So it really matures, and then it has this 500-year period based out of Iraq, largely, Baghdad and in that area, where it's really kind of a golden age of the existence and the civilization. So the golden age of Islam, which we said is during the Abbasid period, so some of the things that happened there, Islamic scholars translated and expanded upon Greek, Persian, and Indian works. So they didn't burn them. They actually took them and worked off of them, right? So they did have a period where they really were trying to move things forward, not just eliminate things. Contributing to mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. You had figures like Al-Khwarizmi, who is known as the father of algebra. So largely algebra development came through The Muslims, right? So if you've ever taken an algebra class, you've studied Islamic thought, right? If you're like me, I hated algebra, right? But it is incredibly useful, right? We owe that to Muslims, right? Ibn Sina, who was a pioneering medical scholar who made lasting contributions to human knowledge during this period of Islamic history, they pioneered early surgeries, right? And pain relief, those kind of things. So a lot of things that we use today medically come from Islamic developments, right? So next time if you have surgery, right, the reason you're not in so much pain, right, they're able to put you out, a lot of that comes from this golden age during the Abbasid dynasty, all right? So that's kind of just a summary of the history of early Islam. Any questions about that? Yes, sir.
Promises, the last question on that.
It doesn't have to be.
The 7th century, Rome was, that's the time when Rome was throwing its chest out too.
A little bit, yep.
How was it that they never,
Rome had really focused a lot on that period towards the west, right? The Germanic tribes, all those kind of things. Rome was largely, it was at a diminishing point at that point as well, right? The borders were stretched immensely. And so they did have some problems on the eastern side of that, but they just didn't have the manpower to really dedicate towards that. So much of it was tied up in Germany, against the Germanic tribes in Britain, in Western. You did have some Muslim incursion from the south as well, right? Up into Spain, the Moors, all of that kind of stuff, right? Coming up from North Africa, eventually. So there were some periods where there were conflicts, right? But by the time the Islamic Golden Age, really Rome was on a pretty large decline, right? The split empire and those kind of things as well. So, and that's one of the things that led, I think, historically probably allowed Islam to spread, was destabilization in the eastern part of the empire, right? There was a lot that could be capitalized upon for people who were moving into those areas at that point. So, all right. So let's get into a couple of key beliefs of Islam. The 5 pillars. You guys have heard of the 5 pillars? Anybody know what they are? Shahada, which stands for? Yes, the profession of faith, right? So the declaration of faith, this is basically a statement, right? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, right? So that would be the English version of the Arabic. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. So this statement affirms the belief in the oneness of God and Muhammad as his final prophet. Muhammad, in his recitations, declares that he is the final prophet of God. Right? So what do they believe about Jesus? Moses, Abraham. They were prophets, they just weren't the final prophet. Jesus is not divine in Islam. That would be heretical to them. The idea that God could become physical flesh is heretical to them, right? Jesus is a prophet. He's a man above most men, but he's just a man, right? And the final prophet is Muhammad, and what he says, or what he recites, having heard from Gabriel, right, from God, kind of takes precedent over everything, right? And we know that because it hasn't been corrupted. It hasn't been put into other languages. They recite it today just like they believe Muhammad recited it in the 7th century. All right? So Shahada, the declaration of faith, is one of those pillars. Number 2 would be Salah, which is prayer. So Muslims perform 5 ritual prayers a day facing Mecca. So if you've ever been around a Muslim, there are certain times of the day they will lay down a prayer mat. They will face Mecca, depending on where they are in the world, and they will go through their prayer recitations. And it doesn't matter where they are. Like, we're doing that at these times, right? So it's a key part of the faith is this idea of salah or prayer. The third is zakat, which is charity. So Muslims are required to give a portion of their wealth to those in need. Typically, it's about 2.5%. So zakat fosters social responsibility. It addresses economic inequality. It's meant to help the poor. So that is a key part of being a faithful Muslim is this idea of regularly giving zakat. Number 5 is Psalm, which is fasting during Ramadan. So during the month of Ramadan, Muslims fast from dawn to sunset. This fast is a time for spiritual reflection, increased worship, and empathy for the less fortunate. So 1 was Shahada, 2 was Salah, 3 is Zakat, which is charity, 4 is Psalm, fasting during Ramadan. And 5 is Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. So every Muslim who is physically and financially able is expected and even required to perform the Hajj pilgrimage at least once in their life. So they're supposed to go to Mecca at least once in their life. This pilgrimage is designed to unite Muslims globally in shared rituals and humility before God. So if you've ever seen pictures of the Hajj, when the pilgrims come in to Mecca and they are walking like around, right? It's an amazing picture. Just hundreds of thousands of people walking in circles around these rites areas, sacred rites areas, right? It's a pretty amazing thing. And it also makes a lot of money from Mecca. Right? They make a lot of money on it. It's funny how that works. All right? So 5 pillars. In addition to the 5 pillars, they also have 6 articles of faith. So 6 articles of faith, things they believe beyond the actions of the 5 pillars. So number 1 is a belief in Allah or a belief in God. They believe in a single, omnipotent, and compassionate God who is the creator and sustainer of the universe. Number 2, a belief in angels. Angels are big in Islamic history, Islamic thought. If you think about that, where did the Quran come from? An angel. Gabriel delivers it. So angels are considered messengers of God who carry out divine commands and communicate revelations to prophets. It's very interesting. A lot of conversion stories in the Middle East from people who go from Islam to Christianity are visions of angels. That they have visions of divine beings telling them about Jesus. It's very common in the Middle East. It never happens in the West. Why? I think God speaks the language we need. I'm not sure an angel would convince me. I would just think my brother figured out some cool stuff. Right? And he was messing with me.
There's even articles in newspapers saying if you've seen him,
Mm-hmm.
you've seen him,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's speaking to.
Visions are a huge thing in people who come to faith in the Middle East, right? Much more than in the West, right? And it seems like it's because God speaks the language people need, is what it seems like, right? So belief in prophets. Islam honors many prophets, including Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, with Muhammad considered the final prophet in a long line of messengers. So all those other guys were great. Muhammad is the final say. So the belief in holy books, right? They have these divine writings, in some sense, or divinely revealed writings. So Muslims do believe in divine scriptures revealed to humanity, including the Torah, the Psalms, the Gospels, and the Quran as the final and preserved word of God. So the Quran is the final, and it is the one that they know is exactly as it was given. The others they respect. But the Quran is the one that is preserved for them, right? They have a belief in the day of judgment. So Islam teaches that all individuals will be resurrected and judged by God based on their faith and deeds. This belief emphasizes accountability and justice. So they believe in a paradise for those who Allah invites, and they believe in punishment eternally for those who are cast out. How do they know if they get into paradise? They don't. Even if you keep everything perfectly, Allah still decides. So it's interesting in the modern sense. So for instance, if you've ever heard in terms of like the jihadi movement, right? How they get people to strap bombs to themselves and blow up people. How do they do that? What do they promise? Paradise. What can another Muslim not be certain of? Paradise. If you notice in the Islamic world, it's never scholars who strap on bombs. It's never imams who put on bombs. Who is it? Poor, uneducated people. Who that they say, if you do this in the service of jihad, right, then you will go to paradise, you and your family. And they promise to take care of their family. That they take this idea that we can't know that Allah is the only one. That we just strive to be in submission and He makes the decision. That they have weaponized it in many places. They've used people's ignorance as a way of really doing some horrific things. Right? But that comes out of the theology of the religion itself a little bit. The uncertainty of knowing if I'm going to go to paradise. So the last one, number 6, would be a belief in divine decree. They call it qadar. So this is the belief in God's ultimate knowledge and control over everything, combined with human responsibility to make moral choices. We have a responsibility to make moral choices according to this, but God is the one who decides. In fact, they'll say it a lot in Arabic, like, inshallah. What does that mean? As God wills. If you ask them a question, often you'll hear it, inshallah, as God wills. We do what we do, but God decides. He decides everything. Right? And so a lot of uncertainty in terms of what does afterlife look like? How can I know? You can't. Unless some dubious guy tells you, this way you can. But that, and we can have a longer conversation if you want about this, but how modern Islam as a political movement has really weaponized the faith and exploited some things that I don't think were ever intended to be that way in Islam. Right? Islam has some real issues as a theology, but the modern political version of it has been corrupted even more so. Like it's really been weaponized in some horrific ways against largely poor people who are trying to do the right thing, right, as best they know. So, with that, let's talk about Islamic law. What, Steve?
Going back to my youth,
Mm-hmm.
in the 60s and 70s,
Yeah, Nation of Islam, some of those movements. Absolutely.
Was that only in America, or has that been a pattern of the growth?
I think you saw it early in the Arabian Peninsula, right? That Muhammad, especially when he left Mecca, they went to these areas where there was a lot of like exploitation, a lot of like, um, kind of rich warlords lording over people and keeping them in poverty and oppressed. And I think he really came in with kind of this sense of let's make things equitable. And if it means we have to overthrow this guy to do it, we will. And then these people owe allegiance to him, and he makes it a little bit better, right? They have a little bit more bread at the house and some of that stuff. And so that's how it spread initially, I think. And so I think there's always been pockets of that as it moved into new places, especially. I think that's the ideal of Islam, right? Is equitability among people, that we're all in submission to Allah, right? And so we should take care of one another at some level. And I think Islam has always been very community oriented, right? It's a familial religion. So not only is it familial, but it's community as well. And so I think there's always been built into it, like even the pillars, this idea of taking care of people. Like that when you see people suffering, you should be responsive to that, right? You have a duty to be responsive to it, right? To be God's representative there. And so, I think you saw that like in the Nation of Islam, right? I think, and I think that's a very like, so if you've been part of an exploited class or a class that's been oppressed, that's a great message, isn't it? Like that, man, there's something out there, a belief system that wants to make things equitable and wants to like care for people and remove the oppressor. Like that's that's something you would want to hear, right? That you would take to. And so I think there was a lot of that in the 60s and 70s in those little pockets. Now, the interesting thing is most of those became militant pretty quickly. Right? Because for them, like it was not just pure Islam. There was also a lot of like political thought in that. I would say Marxism was a big driver, right, within a lot of those movements. And so for them, removing the oppressor was a needed thing in terms of addressing the injustice. You know what I mean? And so I think you had kind of these amalgamations of belief systems, some religious, some political, that kind of came together and wanting to set things right took on a form that got a little bit violent. You know what I mean? And so, and I tend to think that's the way those things always go a little bit is oppressors don't step down because you ask them to. Like people in power don't willingly go, okay, let me give this back. So it's almost like anytime you speak to oppression, you'll have to probably speak with a little bit of like physical interaction. You know what I mean? And so it's hard to know where those lines are drawn, I think. But I know I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, and I can remember growing up listening to some of the early rap groups, right, when I was in high school, right? And even listening to so Tupac Shakur, right? Like Tupac, like I can remember hearing an interview with him about his mom who they got groceries every week from the Black Panthers. And he's like, you guys, think about the Black Panthers as a terrorist group. They fed us. Right? So I think it always depends on our perspective a little bit. Right? I think that it's interesting, where those movements really took off was in communities where they felt like things weren't equitable. And they were a promise of equality at some level. And anytime you have a good movement, there are people involved in it who aren't good. And they tend to corrupt them. And anyway. So let's talk about Islamic law, Sharia. So the definition of Sharia is this. Sharia is a comprehensive system of Islamic law derived from the Quran, the Hadith, consensus of scholars, and analogical reasoning. It addresses all aspects of a Muslim's life, from worship to personal conduct and social justice. So the goal of Sharia is to promote justice, compassion, and welfare Although often misunderstood, Sharia is based on principles that aim to foster moral integrity and community harmony. So, the purpose of Sharia is not always the way that it's been utilized. Because again, if you're a believer in submission, that the duty of all humanity is submit to Allah, then Sharia becomes what? A way of getting others to submit. So in communities in the UK right now, there are whole communities in England that have been overtaken by Muslim immigrants. And they've been smart because they've actually worked through the governmental systems. Now they're on council seats and they basically have their own restricted communities now, right? So they're starting to try to implement their concept of Sharia law. But their concept of Sharia is not built around justice, compassion, and welfare. What is it built around? Submission. You will submit. Right? And so that's going to bring a conflict because guess what the rest of us don't want to do? I don't want to submit to your Allah. Right? You're not going to make me submit to Allah. And so that is the conflict that we face. That true adherents of Islam believe that submission is what the faith is. And their duty is not just to submit, but to do what? Help you to see why you should submit. Right? And so that is a challenge. It is a bit of a challenge, right? So there are two main branches of Islam. Anybody know those two? Sunni and Shia, right? It's why the Iraqis and the Iranians didn't get along, right? Because largely, and it all had to do with secession from Muhammad, right? So the division between Sunni and Shia originated from a dispute over leadership after Muhammad's death. So Christianity has not been the only one that had disputes. So Sunnis believe leadership should go to the most qualified, while Shias felt it should stay within the Prophet's family, favoring Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. So today, Sunnis make up about 85 to 90% of Muslims globally. So they're by far the largest group, while Shias constitute about 10 to 15%. They obviously have some doctrinal differences here and there, but both groups basically share main core beliefs and practices. They're not that different. They just have some long-standing animosity between one another. So let's talk about some cultural and scientific contributions. We've talked a little bit about already, but so Islamic civilization has significantly impacted art, literature, science, from the architectural marvels of the Alhambra and the Mosque of Istanbul to advancements in algebra, medicine, astronomy. Islamic contributions have enriched world heritage. Sometimes we don't hear about that very often. There's also what they call Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism. This is a branch of Islam that emphasizes inner spiritual journey of seeking closeness to God. So why this matters is a lot of Islamic poetry, music, and dance have come out of the Sufi movement, and they really have a way of expressing the pursuit of divine love and unity. So a lot of the artistic and cultural development has come out of the movement towards Sufism. So obviously modern Islam and contemporary issues, we'll kind of wrap up with this. I think it's important to note that Islam is practiced in diverse cultures worldwide, from Southeast Asia to North America, and there's a huge spectrum of practice and belief there, much more practice than belief. But it does have a way of reflecting unique cultural expressions while adhering to core beliefs, right? So the 5 pillars, kind of the 6 key beliefs are pretty common among Muslims, but the cultural expression, especially the way that they identify Sharia, the way that the law should be enacted in communities and governments, differs greatly. And so if you were to go to Saudi Arabia, Islam is practiced very different in Saudi Arabia than it is in a place like Dubai. They're very differently practiced, right? And so I say all that to say that Islam is not a monolith, just like Christianity is not a monolith, where we all practice it the same and we all agree on everything. They have issues with each other just like we do, right? They disagree on things just like we do. And so I hope that as we talk through these things, it gets you on your own to go and maybe pursue some of this understanding a little bit more. So that when we have conversations, not just with each other about these things, but with maybe friends who practice these, that we can talk about it at some level of understanding, right? Maybe even the Spirit uses that to help us have conversations that call people towards God's goodness, right? In ways that maybe they need to hear. So, all right, exactly 2 hours and 1 minute. So, any questions? I want to give you guys a chance to get any questions, but I won't belabor you too much. Yes, ma'am. There are some, both within Sunni and Shia, there are some high-arcing, like scholars and imams. You get within countries, right? For instance, in Iran, right? You have the Ayatollah, the Grand Ayatollah, right? Who is the kind of both the religious, because Iran is officially an Islamic republic. So it's a theocracy. So the Ayatollah is not only the head of the religion in Iran, he's also the head of the state, right? Even though they have a president and they have all that stuff, right? Technically, the Ayatollah and the council, the Islamic council, dictate how things run. So it depends on the country at some level. Usually it's a little bit more centered in that at every mosque you're going to have, or at least larger mosques or Islamic, they call them largely in the U.S., they call them Islamic centers, not mosques, right? Because Islamic center, I think, doesn't sound as threatening to us as mosque does, right? And so I think they're trying to be mindful of us a little bit, which is probably is kind. Usually you're going to have an imam, either in that or at least locally, who is kind of the resident scholar, the resident religious leader. But in terms of a coordinated hierarchy like the Catholic Church, where you have, deacons and then priests and then bishops and then archbishops and then cardinals and then pope, it's not quite as clearly stratified that way, right? It's a little bit different. I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's collaboration, so I'm sure that there's someone who is looked to and respected at a higher level than that. But in terms of having like a pope who's giving out dictates, that doesn't really exist on a global level. It would be more in regional and like national level things, right? So the Ayatollah giving out his dictates or his prescriptions, right, is only going to be listened to by those who kind of follow that particular branch of Islam. Most of the world's not going to care. They don't listen to him, right? But if you're in Iran or if you're Iranian adjacent, like if you're in Hezbollah or in one of those movements, you're probably going to pay a little attention to it because you've kind of acceded to him as a leader at some level. But it doesn't have the strict hierarchy globally that like some of the other systems do in that way. There's no Islamic pope or an equivalent, right? There are respected scholars, but not everybody respects them. You know what I mean? Like, which is part of it's part of why it grows so quickly, because it doesn't have a lot of bureaucracy, Like they can move really quickly, or like in areas. But it also creates some internal challenges. It's why they don't always agree with each other about things, right? Because not only is it competing voices, but you have competing interests in the leaders. Like the leaders are looking out for their own kingdom a little bit. So that creates some challenges for them, right? If you remember when we went into Iraq and we took down the government, and then all of a sudden you had 8 to 12 different groups that were warring in Iraq with each other, right? That the one thing Saddam had done was he was brutal enough that he kept all of them under him, and then we removed him, and what happened? All of these little splinter groups, they didn't care that each other were Muslim. They just wanted to be in control. So Islam is like every other power system that way. There are a lot of people in it looking to have power, and religion's a good way to get it sometimes. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned compassion and mercy.
Mm-hmm.
How do those play out within this doctrinal belief?
So I think within the pillars you see like the charity component, which is meant to show mercy to those who have been received less in life or in different challenges of life. So that is a mechanism of showing God's mercy to them, right? I think through people. I don't know that in most modern Islam that mercy is a predominant trait. Or at least it's not expressed that way, right? I would say that they would say that you would have this idea that Allah is merciful because he allows you to continue to breathe, right? So that's mercy, right? I think that's pretty much how they think about it, right? It is like, well, he's merciful because I'm still breathing, right? And they would say this, right? He will have mercy upon those that he will have mercy. So if good things are happening to me, it's God's mercy. If bad things are happening to me, it's God's justice. It's Allah's justice, right? So he's just and merciful, right? That if bad things happen to me, it's because I deserve it. If it's good things happen to me, it's not because I deserve it, it's because he's merciful, right? And so it's one of the things that they would tend to look at like struggles and challenges in life, again, inshallah, as God wills, right? So if bad things are happening to you, that's just God's will. So outside of that pillar requirement to kind of give to the poor, I don't think they would. Because for them, it's kind of like the disciples when they asked Jesus, who sinned? Right, why is this guy blind? Well, who sinned? Mom or dad? That's very much like a mechanism of most religions. If bad things happen, it's because you deserve it. If good things happen, God's merciful, right? I think that's where Christianity kind of differs in our theological view of suffering, right? Like from both Judaism and Islam a little bit, I think, right? Is that we don't see it that way. So, yes, ma'am?
Do you believe that Muslims and Christians worship the same God?
No. I don't think they would say they do.
I think it's a bit, like I've heard on both sides different spectrums.
Yeah, I think they're lying. Like, we don't believe in the same nature of God, right? So, I think that's, I don't think for strict adherents of either faith that they would describe it that way, if they're honest, right? Because the natures of these two gods are very, very, very different. And so, I think that's a modern way of trying to appease people and maintain sensibilities. I think anybody who looks at the Old Testament Yahweh alone, at Allah within Islam, and then God as revealed through Jesus in the Christian faith, recognizes we're not talking about the same thing necessarily. Certainly we haven't seen the revelation in the same way, right? So no, I don't think a system, for me at least, a system that says that Jesus is not divine is not talking about the same God. I think I think we are reading the revelations very differently. And I think the revelation for them is incomplete. And so I would say that's problematic. I would be more inclined to say that yes, Judaism and Christianity have a same belief in Yahweh than Muslims doing Allah. I don't think Allah is the same concept at all. I think it's a very different thing. But I would even say to somebody in the Jewish faith, right? Like, if God became man and you deny that, are you fully assenting to that God? My answer would be no. And so I think that's going to be very problematic, right, for them at some level. Now, God's gracious. We can read all through the New Testament about how God may reconcile those people to himself, and I don't have a full understanding of what that means in the New Testament. I know God is gracious. I know that God will do the right thing. And that his covenants are not, he does not break covenant. So what that means exactly, I leave to him. It's a Quranic, I think it's either repeated in the Quran, it's one that they draw off in the scriptures. I think it is actually in the scriptures though. Deuteronomy something?